Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and welcome to 2024's Christmas book, Silent Night 3. I haven't read this before. I think it came out right as I was getting done with R.L. Stine and moving on to Christopher Pike and other authors. In fact, I didn't know that this was part of a trilogy until I started doing this show, and I saw the whole list of books for the Super Chillers. Silent Night is my favorite Super Chiller trilogy now. Since the first book was about a robbery and the second book was about a kidnapping, I want to see what happens in the third book. So let's begin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can write me an email at nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I'm also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me tell them tales from R.L. Stine. So thank you very much for listening, and let's get started. Welcome to a Nightfall Audiobooks production of Silent Night 3 by R.L. Stine, a Fear Street Super Chiller, Book 11. Part 1, Chapter 1. Reva Dalby tapped her red nails on the armrest of the cab and waited impatiently for the traffic light to change. The driver could have made it through the yellow. It was just her luck to get a cautious driver, afraid of a little ice on the road. The light finally changed to green. The driver eased the cab forward and headed into North Hills, the wealthy section of Shadyside where Reva lived. When he turned into Reva's driveway, she let out a sigh of relief. Finally, after 12 weeks in that cell Smith College calls a dorm room, I'm finally home. My own private room, with a phone, a bathroom all to myself, no disgusting cafeteria food for almost a month, no early morning classes, no roommate. Well, not exactly, Reva corrected herself, glancing at the short brown-haired girl sitting next to her in the back seat of the cab. Grace Morton was her roommate at college, and Reva had invited her home for the Christmas break. But Grace would stay in one of the guest rooms, naturally. Reva would have plenty of privacy. Quite a house, the cab driver commented, pulling to a stop. It's beautiful, Reva, Grace told her. Reva agreed. She climbed out of the cab and gazed at the big stone house with satisfaction. A large evergreen wreath with a red bow hung from the front door, and small electric candles glowed in the windows. You know what Christmas decoration would look good on that roof? The driver asked, as he hauled her luggage out of the trunk. No, but I'm absolutely dying to, Reva replied sarcastically. Santa and his reindeer, the driver told her. One of those big displays with flashing lights, you know. Reva rolled her eyes. Flashing lights were so tacky. Thanks for the decorating tip, she said, stuffing some bills into the driver's outstretched hand. Very original. Reva, you didn't tip him, Grace whispered, as the driver climbed back into the cab, shaking his head. Reva laughed. He'll get over it. She laughed again as the driver angrily gunned the engine and peeled away. Maybe that'll teach him to keep his tacky opinions to himself. Grace looked shocked. But it's Christmas. Reva shrugged. So, I'll donate his tip to charity, okay? Come on, let's get inside. No, leave the bags. That's what maids are for. Eager to escape the cold December wind, Reva hurried up the steps and pushed open the front door. The foyer was empty. As Reva led Grace across the marble floor toward the stairs, a piercing shriek echoed through the quiet house. Then footsteps pounded down the stairs, and a small figure leaped onto the foyer floor, landing at Grace's feet. Grace gasped and shrank back. Reva frowned. Michael, she cried to her 8-year-old brother, you scared us! I'm not Michael, Michael bellowed. I'm the evil Avenger, the most powerful ninja assassin in the world. His blue eyes gleaming with menace, Michael slashed at the air with his hands and went into a crouch. Slowly, he began stalking Grace. Grace backed away nervously. Before Reva could stop him, Michael spun around and kicked his foot straight up, missing Grace's chin by an inch. Michael? Reva shrieked. She dove across the floor and grabbed his arm. You almost kicked her in the face? Michael twisted away from her, laughing. And I could have, too, he exclaimed, still slashing his hands through the air. I meant to miss, dummy. If I wanted to, I would have knocked her head off. Reva took a deep breath and turned to Grace. Grace watched Michael warily, her round face drained of color. Michael, this is my roommate from college, Grace Morton. She's going to spend the Christmas holiday with us. I'm not Michael, Michael repeated. He whirled around and kicked his leg out again. I'm the Avenger, get it? The evil Avenger. With one final kick, he raced up the stairs. Riva took another breath. Wow, Dad wasn't kidding, I guess. Kidding about what? Grace sat down on the bottom step as if her legs couldn't hold her up any longer. He said Michael has been acting out these violent scenes lately, Riva explained. Dad thinks it's because of my kidnapping. She shivered, remembering the horror of last Christmas, when she thought she was going to die at the hands of kidnappers. Anyway, he's worried about Michael. I can see why. Grace bit her lip and glanced nervously around. Then she jumped up and grabbed Riva's arm. What is it? Riva asked impatiently. Was Grace going to totally fall apart just because a little kid had scared her? Someone's at the door, Grace cried. The front door opened and Riva spun around. One of the maids entered, carrying 2 of the girls' duffel bags. Behind her, carrying 2 more bags, came a trim, handsome man with silver-flecked black hair. Daddy! Riva cried. Brushing past the maid, she ran to her father and hugged him tightly. When I drove up and saw the suitcases outside, I knew my college girl was home, Robert Dalby said. He dropped the luggage and hugged Riva back. And you must be Grace, he added, spotting Grace over Riva's shoulder. Welcome to the Dalby house. Grace smiled and shook his hand. Riva kept her arm around his waist as they all walked into the living room. Daddy, you don't know how glad I am to be home. She kissed his cheek, then collapsed onto one of the soft velvet couches. I thought the first term would never end. Mr. Dalby chuckled and sat in one of the easy chairs. Are they working you pretty hard there, girls? It's a lot harder than I expected, Grace replied, sitting next to Riva. Don't you think so, Riva? Riva yawned. The classes are mainly boring, and the girls are so tacky and immature. I'd be embarrassed to bring any of them home, except for Grace, I mean. Maybe you should send them to Dalby's for a makeover, her father suggested, chuckling again. Robert Dalby was the owner of Dalby's, an expensive upscale department store in Shadyside and other cities around the country. Speaking of the store, he added to Riva, I don't suppose you'd be interested in working there this Christmas. No way, Riva replied. I could really use the help. And you could pick up a little extra spending money, her father pleaded. I don't need any extra spending money, Riva told him. She sighed and leaned her head against the back of the couch. I couldn't take another season of those tacky women bursting out of their stretch pants. It's too hard not to laugh in their faces. They're our bread and butter, honey, Mr. Dalby pointed out. Sure, but I don't have to like them, do I? Laughing, Riva jumped up. Come on, Grace. I'll show you to your room. It has a private bath with a jacuzzi. You'll love it. Riva planted a kiss on her father's cheek, then took Grace upstairs to one of the guest rooms. Grace's bags were already set neatly by the 4-poster bed. The maid must be unpacking my stuff, Riva commented. I'll send her in to you after she's finished. Don't bother, Grace told her. I'd feel funny having somebody unpack my clothes for me. Riva shrugged. Suit yourself. I'll see you in a little while for dinner. Closing the door, she strode down the hall to her own room. The maid stood in front of the big walk-in closet, putting a blue silk blouse on a padded hanger. Do you need glasses? Didn't you see the stain on the front of that? Riva snapped. It needs to be cleaned. Sorry, miss, the maid gulped. She took the blouse off the hanger and draped it over her arm. I didn't notice. Obviously. Riva frowned, then went to her dresser and began to brush her hair. She smiled at her reflection, wavy red hair, creamy white skin, and ice blue eyes. The frown returned as she noticed the maid behind her, going back and forth between the closet and the bed. Honestly, couldn't Daddy get someone with a little bit of style? This one slumped, and her hair looked like gray straw. Ever hear of conditioner? Riva muttered. Excuse me? The maid replied. I didn't hear you. Never mind. Just talking to myself, Riva said. If you don't need me any more, miss, I'll go help with dinner, the maid said. Be my guest. When the maid had left, Riva showered quickly. She changed into black wool pants and a burgundy satin blouse. She fluffed her hair with her fingers, then went back to see Grace's room. Riva rapped once with her knuckles, then opened the door. Grace sat on the bed, holding the telephone so tightly her knuckles were white. Seeing Riva, she glanced up. Riva gasped. Terror filled Grace's brown eyes. Grace, what is it? Riva asked. What's wrong? Grace put her hand over the mouthpiece. It's Rory, she whispered in a shaky voice. He knows I'm here. I'm so scared, Riva. How did he find me? Chapter 2 I just don't understand, Grace whispered, trembling. How did Rory know I'd be here? Riva rolled her eyes. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure this one out. You must have slipped up and told him. Grace shook her head. I didn't, she protested hoarsely. Well, then, you told one of the other girls in the dorm, Riva said impatiently, and she let him know. No, I didn't say a word to any... Grace suddenly took her hand off the mouthpiece of the phone. Please, Rory, she pleaded, just leave me alone. No, I don't want to see you. No, please, don't come here. I mean it, Rory. Don't come here. I'll call the police. I really will. As Grace continued to plead with Rory, Riva crossed the room and sat in the floral-patterned armchair by the window. Gazing out at the snow-covered grounds, she tuned out Grace's conversation and thought back to that day in the dorm room when she had first heard about Rory Givens. She'd been curled up on her uncomfortable bed, trying to study for a French exam, when Grace suddenly burst into the room. Grace slammed the door and leaned against it, gasping for breath. Going out for the track team? Riva asked, glancing up at Grace's flushed face. I saw, Grace swallowed, still gasping. Then she turned and began fumbling at the lock on the door. The lock is broken, Riva reminded her. And what is the matter with you? What did you see? Not what? Who? Grace replied shakily. Okay, who? Riva pushed her French notes aside. Tell me, she demanded. Grace took a deep breath. I saw Rory. He was standing outside the library when I came out. At least, I think it was him. I can't be totally sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. This is exactly the kind of thing he would do. Whoa, Riva held up her hand. Start at the beginning, would you? Who's Rory? That's right, I haven't told you. Pushing herself away from the door, Grace crossed the room and sat at the foot of Riva's bed. Rory Givens is my boyfriend. She shook her head. Make that was my boyfriend. What happened? Riva asked. He's crazy. That's what happened, Grace replied with a shudder. Crazy and jealous and totally possessive. I mean, if I even looked at another guy, Rory would go ballistic. She drew her legs up and wrapped her arms around her knees. So I broke up with him, Riva snorted. Well, I hope so. It was awful, Grace continued with a shudder. Rory said he'd never let me go, and he was so furious. I thought I'd never seen him so angry. But then, a couple of weeks later, I ran into his brother Terry. Terry is totally different, quiet and kind of shy. Anyway, he gave me a ride home from the mall. After he drove off, I went up onto the porch, and Rory was waiting. Uh-oh. Grace nodded again. That's when I realized how crazy Rory really was. He looked as if he wanted to kill me, Riva. He said I had ruined his life and he'd pay me back if it was the last thing he ever did. And then he beat me up, Riva gasped. He threw me down on the ground and pounded me with his fists. My cheeks were cut. I was all bruised. Even now I get nightmares about it. Riva gritted her teeth. If some guy did that to me, I'd have him in jail so fast he wouldn't have time to blink. Well, my parents did have Rory arrested, Grace went on, but he didn't spend any time in jail or anything, and he kept calling me, sending me threatening notes, sneaking up on me in school and following me home. I couldn't wait for the summer to end so I could go to college. I thought once I got to Smith, everything would be over. Obviously, everything is not over. Not if you saw this creep outside the library. Well, I'm not sure it was Rory, Grace said, but even if it wasn't, it's just a matter of time. He's called me here at Smith, too, and I got another threatening note from him last week. He said he hasn't finished paying me back yet. Now, Riva gazed across the guest room at Grace, who was still on the phone, trying to convince Rory to leave her alone. Fat chance, Riva thought. Grace sounded weak and whiny, not exactly the kind of attitude to scare somebody like Rory Givens off. Riva sighed. Why had she invited Grace home for the holiday? Holidays were supposed to be fun and relaxing. The last thing she wanted was trouble from somebody's freaked-out ex-boyfriend. Of course, Grace had been afraid to go home, afraid of Rory. That's why Riva had invited her. Riva smiled tightly as Grace finally hung up the phone. Maybe I'll get a humanitarian award for this, she thought. So, did you tell him where to get off? She asked. I tried. Grace's brown eyes were huge in her pale face, and her voice shook. He's worse than ever, Riva. He's still so bitter and furious. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. Go home, Riva thought coldly. Now there was an idea. Maybe she could make up some kind of excuse. A ski trip she'd forgotten about, or some last-minute guest who'd take up every spare room. Or she could come down with a horrible case of the flu. Anything to get Grace and her problem out of here. The ski trip, Riva decided. So sorry, Grace, but I can't pass up a chance to go to Aspen. I know you understand. The phone rang, and Riva rose from the chair to answer it. Maybe she could pretend it was someone calling to remind her about the ski trip. Riva reached for the receiver. No! Grace slammed her hand over the telephone. Don't answer it. What do you mean? Riva cried. Don't answer it, Grace repeated, fear in her eyes. She tightened her hand over the ringing phone. It's Rory again. I know it is. Chapter 3. Come on, Riva, pick up. Pam Dalby, Riva's cousin, sat across town in her family's ramshackle house on Fear Street and listened to the ringing telephone. Come on. Maybe she isn't there, Pam's friend, Willow Sorensen, suggested. She's there, Pam said grimly. I know she got home today. Why won't she pick up the stupid phone? Willow shrugged and popped open a can of diet soda. Doesn't she have a servant or something that could pick up for her? She asked. No way, Pam answered. No one but Riva is allowed to pick up the phone when she's home. The servants would get their heads handed to them if they tried. Maybe you dialed the wrong number, Willow offered. Hang up and try again. Pam shook her head. She knew she hadn't dialed wrong. Her cousin Riva just wasn't answering. It's like she knows it's me and she's getting her kicks by pretending not to be there, Pam thought angrily. Well, two can play this game. I'll just let it ring until Riva goes nuts and finally picks up just to stop it. Leaning back in a lumpy easy chair, Pam tucked the phone against her shoulder. She picked up a long cherry-red scarf that was draped over the chair's arm. Riva owes me a favor, she thought, running the scarf through her hands. She has got to come through this time. Pam glanced around the living room. It needed painting. The furniture was all worn, and patches of floor showed through the threadbare rug. But fixing up the house was a luxury her family couldn't afford. So was college. Pam sighed. Why couldn't her side of the Dalby family be the rich ones? She'd been accepted to a couple of colleges, but her grades weren't good enough for a scholarship. To earn tuition money, she had taken a job in the Acme Insurance Company, typing and filing. Willow worked there too, and they became friends. Hey, Willow broke into Pam's thoughts. How long are you going to let that thing ring anyway? As long as it takes. Willow shook her head, then unwrapped a stick of gum and folded it into her mouth. The tiny gold hoop in her left nostril wiggled and glinted as she chewed. Willow kept urging Pam to get her nose pierced too, but Pam wasn't sure she wanted to. It was okay for Willow. It seemed to go with her short, brassy blonde hair and the tiny orange lightning bolt tattooed above her right collarbone. Pam glanced at her own reflection in the mirror over the fireplace. Bright green eyes, long blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, a round, friendly face, the kind you saw in an ad for down-home cooking or handmade quilts. A nose ring just didn't seem to fit. The phone kept ringing. Pick up, Pam urged. She twisted the red scarf around her hands. I'll strangle you with this if you don't pick up, Riva. This is getting ridiculous, Willow muttered, snapping her gum impatiently. Why don't you? Wait, I think somebody's answering, Pam interrupted, sitting up in the chair. First, she heard a muffled whisper. Then finally, Riva said hello, sounding annoyed. Hi, Riva, it's Pam. Pam? Riva actually sounded confused for a second. Oh, Pam, hang on a second. More muffled whispering. Then Riva came back on the line. Hi, I was just talking to my roommate Grace. She's spending the holiday with me. That's nice. I called to welcome you home, Pam told her. How's Smith? Please, don't even mention college to me, Riva sighed loudly. It's totally boring. Really? I thought college life would be so much fun, Pam said. You thought wrong, Riva replied. We actually have a curfew. We have to sign in and out of the dorm. Can you believe it? They treat us like babies. You're lucky you're in the real world, Pam. Sure, Pam thought bitterly, like I had a choice. I mean, you're working, making money, meeting people, having business lunches, Riva continued. Right. $5 an hour and a bologna sandwich from home. Pam bit her lip and forced herself not to snap at Riva. It was hard, though. Riva knew how much Pam wanted to go to college. She always enjoyed sticking a knife in someone's sore spot. Well, listen, speaking of business, Pam said, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. She smoothed the scarf across her legs. It was beautiful, a soft, silky wool scarf, silk-screened with delicate golden snowflakes. You want to talk about business? Riva asked skeptically. What business? My friend, Willow Sorensen? She works at the same place I do, Pam continued. Anyway, we took a crafts course together, and we made something for Christmas. Handmade gifts? How charming! Pam ignored the sneer in Riva's voice. We didn't make them to give away, she said. We want to sell them, and we thought maybe your father could put them in his stores. Riva cleared her throat. Actually, Pam, Daddy doesn't sell clay pots at Dalby's? Pam gritted her teeth. Riva was such a snob. It's not clay pots, she said, keeping the anger out of her voice. Listen, how about if Willow and I drive over to your house? Now? We'll only stay 10 minutes, Pam assured her. We're really anxious to show these to you. Well, okay. Sure, why not? You can meet my roommate Grace, Riva said. Great. Thanks, Riva. We'll be right over. Pam hung up and jumped from the chair. Come on, let's get going, she said to Willow. The princess actually agreed to see us, huh? Willow asked sarcastically. Pam nodded as she and Willow began gathering the long scars from the coffee table and carefully folding them into shopping bags. I wish we didn't have to talk to her at all, she declared, but Riva's father does almost anything she asks, and if she likes our scars, then Uncle Robert will definitely take them. Riva is our best chance. Willow picked up a bag and grabbed her car keys. Pam took the other bag and followed her out the door. They climbed into Willow's battered blue VW Rabbit and drove down Fear Street. Where does she live? Willow asked. North Hills, Pam told her. Where else? Very fancy, Willow commented. I always wondered what it would be like to live there. Pam grinned. If we make a bundle on these scars, maybe you'll get a chance to find out. Yeah, Willow agreed. Hey, and if the scarves are a hit, people will want more of our designs. Not only scars, but clothes too. We could start our own design company, Pam agreed excitedly. We'd be the designers and hire people to do the work for us. And we'd never have to set foot in the Acme Insurance office again, Willow added with a laugh. I can't wait to kiss that place goodbye. Let's hope your cousin really likes the scars. She will, Pam assured her. If there's one good thing about Riva, it's her taste. 5 minutes later, the girls pulled to a stop in the curved drive in front of the Dalby mansion. Chatting excitedly about everything they'd do with the money their scars would bring in, they carried the shopping bags to the front door and pushed the bell. Pam smoothed a strand of her hair back, wishing she'd taken the time to brush it out. Being at Riva's house always made her feel slightly grubby. Stop thinking like that, she told herself. Riva is no better than you are. She just has more money. After a moment, a maid pulled open the door slightly and peered out at them. Yes? Hi, remember me? I'm Pam, Riva's cousin, Pam told her. She's expecting us. She picked up her shopping bag and waited for the maid to pull the door open all the way. But the maid didn't move. I'm sorry. There must be some mistake, she said. What do you mean? Pam asked. I mean, Miss Dalby isn't home. What? I just talked to her 10 minutes ago, Pam protested. She knew we were coming. I don't know anything about that, the maid informed her. All I know is that Miss Dalby and her friend left 5 minutes ago. But she told us to come over, Pam insisted. The maid shook her head. Maybe you misunderstood her. I'll be sure to tell her you were here. She closed the door, leaving Pam and Willow alone on the cold stone porch. Willow tossed her head. Looks like the princess had something more important to do than talk to us. Right. Pam's face burned with anger. There was no mistake, she cried as she and Willow started back toward the car. And I didn't misunderstand anything. Riva knew we were coming. She just wanted to put me in my place. Why does she always do this to me? Willow turned and glanced back at the mansion. Her pale blue eyes narrowed. Don't worry, she muttered. We'll find a way to pay her back. Pam stared at her. What? What did you say? Nothing. Willow cracked her gum and smiled grimly. Nothing at all. Chapter 4. Riva stood on the main floor of Dalby's department store and gazed around nervously. I shouldn't have come here to pick Daddy up. I should have let the driver bring him home. The store stood empty, closed for the day. The main lights had been turned off, and the dim security lights cast long shadows over the glass counters. I shouldn't have come here, Riva thought again. Being in the store after closing still gives me the creeps. Turning quickly, Riva glanced behind her. No one stood there, aiming a gun, ready to kill her. It's over, she reminded herself. The kidnapping happened a year ago. Go upstairs and get Daddy. He's waiting. Riva gave herself a shake, then started across the darkened floor into the cosmetics department. What was that noise? Riva spun around again. No one. Running her hand along the cool glass of a perfume counter, Riva hurried through the cosmetics department. She crossed an aisle and began making her way past racks of winter coats and displays of sweaters. A group of shadowy, dark-coated figures suddenly loomed up in front of her. Gasping, Riva stumbled backward into a rack of parkas. The heavy jackets seemed to close in on her. She frantically batted at them and scrambled away. The figures were still there. They didn't move or come after her. They just stared down at her with glassy eyes in their stony faces. Glassy eyes. Smooth, stony faces. Mannequins. Riva let out a shaky breath. She'd been terrified by a bunch of plastic mannequins. Scolding herself, she continued through the clothing department. More mannequins arranged in fashion model poses peered down at her as she made her way toward the bank of elevators on the far wall. When she reached it, she stopped, confused and stunned. The elevators had disappeared. The wall was totally solid. What was going on? The elevators had to be here. Riva ran her hands along the wall. No gleaming elevator doors, no shiny buttons to push. Had she gotten turned around in the darkness? It didn't seem possible, but... Riva gasped as a tune began to crackle from the loudspeakers. Silent Night. Riva shivered with fright. The same song had played the night of the kidnapping, the night she'd almost been killed, and now it was playing again. Silent Night. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears. Sweat broke out on her forehead. She had to get upstairs, get her father, and get out of here. The music seemed to grow louder as Riva hurried back through the clothing department, toward the opposite side of the store. Past the hovering mannequins, through the racks of coats, and back into the cosmetics department. Find the elevators and get out of here. The music soared. It was getting louder. Breaking into a run, Riva knocked into a display of perfume bottles. Glass shattered on the polished floor. A sweet, overpowering scent rose into the air. Riva kept running. The music pounded in her ears. Riva dashed past a display of designer makeup and raced toward the far wall. No elevators here either. Where were they? How could elevators just disappear? Frantic to get away from the music, she raced back through the cosmetics department, then turned toward the center of the store where the escalators were. They'd be turned off, of course, but at least she could climb up them to the executive offices on the 6th floor. Huh? The escalators were gone too. Riva stared at the empty space, shaking her head in disbelief. What was going on? Silent Night stopped, then started again. The music didn't just play by itself, Riva thought. Somebody had to turn it on. Somebody had changed the store around, made things disappear, made it so she couldn't get away, trapped her in here. Riva suddenly shivered as she heard movement behind her. Creaking, groaning sounds, and a loud thumping. Footsteps. Terrified, Riva spun around and screamed. The mannequins! The mannequins were moving stiffly down the aisle toward her. Alive, Riva thought. The mannequins are alive. Their plastic limbs creaked as they came closer. Closer. Riva looked to her right, to her left. More mannequins, dressed in winter coats, in beaded evening gowns, and delicate silk lounging robes. They stalked toward her. Screaming again, Riva backed up. The mannequins closed in, surrounded her. Please, Riva gasped. Stop! The mannequins pressed closer. Their faces were cold and blank. Their glassy eyes gleamed in the dull light. Empty eyes. Dead eyes. Riva tried to scream again, but the mannequins pressed even closer. She sank to her knees, felt their weight on top of her. She couldn't breathe. They were smothering her. Please, she thought, please. Something soft and thick filled her mouth. I'm going to die. Riva jerked her head aside and tried to take a deep breath. Sweet, cool air filled her lungs. Her eyes snapped open to darkness. Empty, quiet darkness. No mannequins. No Silent Night. No store. A nightmare, Riva realized with relief. She shoved her thick comforter away from her face and took another deep breath. She was in her bed, in her room. She'd had a hideous nightmare. Another nightmare. So many horrible things had happened to her at the store. It was no wonder she had nightmares about it. Pushing her damp hair off her forehead, Riva groaned and sat up, and froze in terror as two hands grabbed her in the darkness.